Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to the rollout event for our newest report, Undersea Warfare in Northern Europe. And if you don't have the handout, we have a few floating around, so be sure to grab one on your way out. My name is Lisa Sawyer-Samp. I am a senior fellow here at CSIS in our International Security Program and one of the co-authors of the report. Before we kick off, I do need to do a quick security announcement, so bear with me. Overall, we feel very secure in our building, but as a convener, we have a duty to prepare for an emergency situation. I will serve as your responsible safety officer at this event, so please follow my instructions should the need arise. Finally, take a moment to familiarize yourself with the emergency exit pathways for this room. In the back, and there's one up here in the front. So additionally, before we get started, I need to say a big thank you to Saab North America for their generous support in making today's event possible. And first up, I wanted to introduce Andrew Metrick. Andrew is going to be giving us a brief overview of the report before we turn to our panel. And he is another co-author of the report, a research assistant here at CSIS, and our general capabilities guru. So you'll be very impressed with everything he has to say. So Andrew, over to you. And thank you all for being here.
Good afternoon. As Lisa said, my name's Andrew Metrick. I'm a research associate in the International Security Program and one of the authors of this study. So I'm just going to take a brief time to go over sort of what the key findings of the study were, what were some of our big takeaways from the entire process. So I think we've all sort of seen over the past couple years an increase in Russian operational tempo that have been engaged in, we perceive as new and worrying activities at sea. Major components of these have sort of taken place around the European landmass, whether that's in the Baltic, North Atlantic, or Mediterranean. For this study in particular, we look specifically at two basins, the North Atlantic broadly, and then the Baltic Sea a little bit more specifically. On the Russian activity piece, Vice Admiral Clive Johnson, who's the commander of Allied Maritime Command, was quoted pretty widely about his statement where he asserted that Russian activities were at the highest level since the end of the Cold War. The key thing to remember about that statement is the way it was reported often left out that last clause, the since the end of the Cold War. So we really tried to hone in and make sure that we were capturing the essence of the Russian threat without sort of building the Russians into this 10-foot tall man that they aren't today. The Russians themselves have also admitted that they're increasing their operational tempo. The previous head of the Russian Navy, Admiral Cherkov, stated in 2015 that their submarine activities had increased 50% in 2015 when compared to 2014. As part of this study, the team had the opportunity to travel throughout the region, stopping in UK, Sweden, Finland, and Warsaw. In addition, we conducted another workshop here in DC. These were all tremendously helpful in sort of building out our findings and making sure that we were tempering the report's conclusions correctly. So this is a useful image. It's actually taken from a study that looked at NATO anti-submarine warfare, science and technology cooperation during the Cold War. So there's some things about it that are a little bit off, notably the breakout route of Russian subs from the Baltic Sea into the North Sea might not be the operational construct of the day, but however, this really captures sort of the scope of the problem. So for us, looking to the north, you can see the two main areas of concern in the Baltic, and then coming out of the Kola Peninsula through the GI-UK gap and sort of out into the broader Atlantic. What this doesn't show, and something I want to home in on, is the difference in the threat and the way that it has to be addressed in the Baltic Sea vice North Atlantic. The North Atlantic is wide open. There are some exploitable choke points. NATO used this to its advantage in years past. It's unclear how much this is going to be able to be used to their advantage today, simply because of increases in Russian capabilities which I will touch on in a little bit more detail later on. In the Baltic Sea, it's really a very, very difficult environment for one to conduct anti-submarine operations. It's shallow, it's confined. For those that operate small submarines, there are many places to hide. There's lots of unexploded ordnance left over from World War II and the Cold War. I don't know if anyone saw, but during the most recent Baltops exercise, there were reports of some of the demining units actually finding World War II era mines buried 10 feet down in the mud. So it's clearly a very challenging area to operate in, and it's something that's going to have to be, that difference between the two basins is something that needs to be remembered and respected. So what do we think the Russians are up to? There's a host of activities that have been, that we view are concerning. Probably the most widely reported was the territorial, believed to be territorial violation conducted by what most people think is a Russian submarine in Sweden in October 2014. There are reports that were released by the Swedish Ministry of Defense that showed what looks to be like a periscope inside the Stockholm archipelago. The Swedes spent roughly a week looking for the submarine, and there was no sort of conclusively stated public statement that said, this is what it was, this is what we found. But again, enough historical antecedents that we're fairly certain it was a Russian sub. And then also, alarmingly for our close friends in the UK, there were Russian submarines that have been reported to be operating in close proximity to the home of the British nuclear deterrent at Fastlane. Those are particularly concerning because the UK, with the divestiture of the Nimrod anti-submarine warfare aircraft, has none of that capability. So they were forced to reach out to their allies in NATO to sort of say, hey, we need this, get it in, and start looking for the submarines. Some important things to remember about these sort of activities. In many ways, Russia is returning to its normal course of operations during the Cold War. So what we perceive now as aggressive is really more of a return to what normalcy was. And that was one of the core things that we found in the studies, that there's a pretty big gap between how we perceive the activities and what's actually going on in reality. However, that's not to say that there aren't places where Russia is actually carrying out aggressive activities. Territorial violations in places such as Sweden and Finland, activities near undersea cables, blocking of the laying of undersea cables, primarily the Nordbalt or Swedlet, depending on how you want to refer to it, undersea cable in the Baltic Sea are clearly provocative. What this all sort of shows us is that Russia is using its undersea capabilities as part of what we perceive to be a larger coercive campaign aimed at allies and partners in Europe. And also, what these have shown is that there's a current lack of ASW capability and capacity amongst partners in the region. So this is sort of a snapshot of the Russian Navy today, looking specifically at its submarine fleet. It's important to note the Russian submarine fleet is considerably smaller than it was in the late 1980s and very early 1990s. There was about 240 submarines at the end of the Cold War. There are roughly 56 in the Russian fleet. Looking at the Russian fleet is always a challenging thing to do, simply because it's unclear what is and is not operational in the fleet. So what Russia claims is often not what it actually can put to sea. That said, Russia has been slowly overhauling its modern core of nuclear-powered attack submarines, ballistic missile submarines, and SSKs. Diesel-powered submarines. That core force is very capable, well-trained, and very proficient in undersea warfare. On the material side, there's a new generation of Russian submarines coming out, a new ballistic missile submarine, a new nuclear-powered attack submarine. From what we can tell from open source reporting, they're fantastic submarines. However, there aren't that many of them, and they've been subject to extremely difficult procurement processes, and it's unclear how many of them Russia will be able to afford going forward. I briefly want to talk about something that isn't talked about a lot, and it's the Russian Auxilary submarine force. Russia operates a small number of very small nuclear-powered submarines that are capable of diving, believed to be in excess of several thousand meters. The U.S. used to operate a submarine like this. It was called NR-1. It was a small, deep submergence vessel that was used for research and other tasks. We don't operate it anymore. It was old. It had to be replaced. The difference being is that the Russians, in their ingenuity, figured out a way that to mate a small, deep submergence vehicle with a converted ballistic missile submarine, which is what the graphic shows here. One can only, if one puts their imagination to it, you can imagine what a clandestine deployable deep submergence vehicle could be used for, and how that it's pretty scary when you start thinking about some of the types of missions that it could be used for. And we just thought this was something important to highlight. It's probably the most shadowy part of the Russian undersea apparatus. It's not operated by the Navy. It's operated by a separate branch of their Ministry of Defense. But when you take a look at it, it's something that one has to keep in the back of their mind. So where do we think the Russian Navy is going? There are clear challenges. The sanctions that are a result of their activities in Ukraine have hurt them, especially in terms of their ability to procure Western electronics. Machine tooling is a big one from an industrial base perspective. Their shipyards will likely face a fall off in trained personnel sometime in the near future, simply because of demographic issues and a sort of lack of funding through the 1990s and early 2000s. What I collectively refer to as the post-Soviet naval platforms have encountered problems, decades-long development and production delays. However, and this is the key part to remember, is what they do have is very good. The new submarines are technically excellent. The head of the Naval Warfare Center out at Carderock had a model of the new Severod-Vinsk class SSN built in his office because he was so impressed with it. And we're going to have to, this is something we're going to have to monitor. In the Baltic and for their diesel-powered submarine fleets, it's a little bit more unclear. They're clearly prioritizing their nuclear-powered boats, and they've sort of struggled with building newer diesel boats. But what they do have, again, is modern, it's increasingly well-maintained, and the personnel behind it are generally pretty good. So, sort of moving on to NATO. Comes to no surprise that ASW capabilities have atrophied. NATO didn't think it was going to be involved in sort of territorial defense and high-end warfighting. In all of its documents, it was looking more at Afghanistan stability operations, those type of activities. That shows up in sort of the types and kinds of equipment that was being purchased. That said, there's a solid core of submarines within NATO, and other capabilities have fallen further than that. That said, there are some promising signs of recapitalization in places such as Sweden, France, and the UK. Longer term, there are additional opportunities in places such as Norway, Spain, Poland. And then there's, looking further afield than that, in the mid-2020s, it's likely that both France and Germany will be considering how they replace their ASW aircraft. So based on these shortcomings, to sort of meet and counter the Russian threat, what were our recommendations coming out of that? So they sort of fall into three categories. The first being, what were the organizational changes that we believe needed to be made to sort of counter Russian activities? The first of which is that there's a gap or wedge in the Baltic Sea. The two most important and most capable Baltic Sea states, Finland and Sweden, aren't inside NATO and have a historic neutrality that has to be respected. At the same time, they're subject to the same sort of coercive actions as NATO members in the Baltic Sea are. So bridging that gap and finding a way that both respects their sovereignty and allows a greater interoperability of capabilities is important moving forward. As part of that is a lack of integrated information sharing approach across NATO and across that Baltic Sea gap in particular. That's not a problem that's particularly specific to ASW, and is something NATO has dealt with for several years. And then there's been a lack of regular high-intensity ASW exercises. So for these reasons, we sort of recommended the following. The Alliance Maritime Strategy hasn't been updated since 2011. It sort of clearly reflects a different world and should likely be revised. We thought that NATO-NORDEFCO cooperation was an interesting route to take to bridge that Baltic Sea gap, understanding that that's probably a first step, and there are other things that are going on, such as the Enhanced Opportunity Partnership, host support agreements that have been signed between Sweden and Finland that will go a step beyond and help close that gap further. Creating a NATO Center of Excellence for ASW, sort of creating a common playbook for theater ASW, that's sort of the outgrowth of that center and can also help drive. There are several centers in NATO that look at issues that touch ASW, whether that's the Center for Operations and Confined and Shallow Waters, the Counter Mine Center of Excellence, their S&T facility in Italy. ASW Center of Excellence can help sort of drive cohesion between those. Aligning the NATO framework nations on the standing NATO maritime groups, sort of give those a backbone that can help drive those forward and rebuild high-end warfighting capabilities, information sharing again, and then an uptick in training. One of the key things about anti-submarine warfare, anyone that's done it will tell you, is that it requires constant training. It's a proficiency that has to be built and then maintained. And that's something that we haven't necessarily done over the past 15 years and something that's going to need to happen again, but will not come back quickly. On the capability side, the shortcomings that we identified in the study, we believe are the result of different investment patterns and different threat perceptions that have created a sort of mismatched capability level across the alliance. There's a need to sort of level set that to the greatest degree possible, and where possible, create synergies across the alliance so one country is investing more in one type of system and another in something that's complementary. There are aging systems, and there's just a general lack of capacity. So the big three in terms of ASW hard capabilities: maritime patrol aircraft, submarines, future networking that allows you to drive information between submerged and surface platforms, integrating land attack weapons on existing NATO submarines, a little bit outside the precise scope of the study, but sort of folded into some of the other research that the International Security Program has been doing on countering the Russian threat more broadly. We believe that's a powerful signaling tool to other elements of the Russian coercion strategy. And lastly, leveraging non-military platforms for acoustic intelligence collection is sort of an interesting idea of how one might use oceanographic research vessels in a sort of crisis situation to reinforce your existing ASW platforms only as sensor platforms. And lastly, posture changes. There's only two. The first is something that we would like to see, but it is politically challenging. The Russians, should be specific about this. In the early 2000s, the Norwegians deemed their previous submarine base in northern Norway to be surplus, went through the process of divesting of it, put it on sale on the Norwegian version of eBay. It was bought by a private investor who then leased it to a Russian deep-sea exploration firm with close ties to Gazprom, which raised some concerns amongst people in the submarine warfare community about what exactly the Russians were doing. Given the current climate, there have been some rumblings about the Russians being kicked out. It's a very useful facility. The US had rotational visits there in years past during the Cold War. For countries that wish to participate in any sort of theater ASW activities in the GI-UK gap, it's a particularly useful facility to conduct resupply and other repair type work. And second is using the former Naval Air Station Keflavik, which is currently also the international airport in Keflavik, as a support facility for rotational maritime patrol aircraft activities in the GI-UK gap. So that's something that's currently happening on a US basis, and it's been funded through the European Reassurance Initiative, ERI. We would like to see that moving forward. Other nations who are interested in participating rotate through there. It also gives an opportunity for them to operate with other NATO allies, build interoperability, and also help rebuild some of those fundamental skills, which I talked about earlier that really require constant training in order to maintain and build. So that's sort of what we did and what we found. If you're interested in reading a full copy of the report, not just the abridged one we handed out, you can go to csis.org/undersea warfare. And with that, we'll take a 2-second break to mic up the panelists, and then we'll turn it over to our panel.
About that. So I'm Kathleen Higgins. I direct the International Security Program, and I want to thank Lisa and Andrew in particular for that great briefing overview of the study. As we said, there are short versions out there, but if you, forgive this terrible pun, would like to deep dive on this issue, there is a very full report available online, which I encourage you to look at. You've heard sort of an overview of how CSIS's study team looked at the issue, and then we wanted to bring to you some independent experts to bring their take on this issue set, and I'm very pleased to have the panel before us. To my immediate left is Olga Oliker, who directs our Russia program here at CSIS, Russia and Eurasia program. Her recent research has been focused on military, political, economic, and social development in countries in transition, particularly focused on Russia, Ukraine, and the Central Asian and Caucasus successor states of the Soviet Union. Prior to joining CSIS, Olya held a number of senior positions at the RAND Corporation, most recently as director of RAND's Center for Russia and Eurasia. To her left is Steve McCarthy, who is the Minister of Defense Materiel at the British Embassy here in Washington. Jointly with the Defense Attaché, Steve is responsible for all aspects of the UK-US defense relationship, and he previously served, among many other positions, as the Director of International Security Policy in the UK Ministry of Defense. And finally, on the end, we have Brian Clark, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. And prior to joining CSBA in 2013, Brian was Special Assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations and Director of his Commander's Action Group and he has previously served up to 2007 in the Navy, both as an enlisted and officer submariner. So we wanted to bring to you today sort of a range of perspectives from looking at Russia to looking at allied and partner capabilities to looking at what the U.S. brings, and have a little bit of a conversation about where we think this panel, esteemed panel, thinks this issue set is going and how serious the challenge is. So if I may start with you, Olya, and just get your perspective. You've seen, obviously, the briefing. You actually helped us, being in-house here at CSI, has helped us in shaping it. But I'd love to get your sense of what you think the Russians' objectives are with regard to the development of its naval and particularly subsurface capabilities, and the extent to which that's manifesting itself, how it's pursuing those objectives is manifesting itself in the activity we've been seeing in Northern Europe.
Thanks, Kath. I'd like to begin by saying that this is really an excellent report, and I do recommend reading the whole thing. My only real quibble with it is with its title, in the sense that we're not actually, it's not warfare, right? It's preparation, it's potentially deterrence, it's activities, some of which are dangerous, but it's not actually warfare. And that's, I think that's an interesting thing to think about. When you are looking to deter, when you are looking to respond to another nation, what are you doing because it would make you more effective in an actual conflict, and what are you doing for various political goals? And I think that's also important in looking at Russia. And I think also, as the report very clearly reflects, and I think Andrew's overview suggested, one of the challenges in looking at Russian military development today is that there is this study in contrasts which support a range of narratives, right? So I could tell you a story about how incredibly good Russian capabilities are, about how quiet the subs are, about the cruise missiles on the Yasin class. I could tell you that story. I can also tell you a story about how incompetent and backwards they are, about how everything they've got, even that's the most modern things they have were in development for 2 decades, and they only have a handful of them. So what's the truth here? My take tends to be, and I think this is true of the Russian armed forces as a whole, is that you've got a improving system with pockets of real competence and spots of excellence, and that submarines are definitely one of the pockets of competence, but they're small pockets. Moreover, I think it's important to remember that the Navy is not the priority for the Russian Federation. So we can talk about naval priorities, but when we talk about Russian naval priorities, we have to remember that the Navy has only started getting resourcing recently because the military as a whole has gotten more resourcing. Throughout the 90s, the Navy was at the bottom, and it's a trickle-down effect. They get around to supplying and helping the Navy when they've taken care of everything else. So, having said that, what do I think the prospects are? I think that, again, you've got this interesting study in contrast. The Soviet Union made it very clear that the core mission of the Navy was strategic nuclear deterrence. And yet, in the strategic nuclear deterrence mission, the Navy was not, by any stretch of the imagination, the most important piece of it. The Russians did not think of their submarines as their survivable leg. They think of their mobile ICBMs as their survivable leg. So the most important thing for the Navy wasn't actually that important for the Russian armed forces as a whole. The Russians still are putting a lot on that SSBN fleet. I would argue not because they think it's that survivable. They're not even patrolling that much with these. But a lot of it is about parity with the United States, perceived as a sort of equality. But in the context of how they actually think about fighting, again, these things don't patrol that much. They can fire from port, but that makes them just really bad ICBMs. So that is a priority, but it's not a priority. You do have these new systems that are coming online, most of them in development since the 90s, the Yasin class. The Lada class diesel subs got in trouble. They got canceled in 2011, brought back on in 2012. In the meantime, there's a revamped Kilo class that is much quieter than past ones. There's a new Kalina class that's in development, but it's not really clear what it's going to be. They've been behind on air-independent propulsion. They're working on this stuff. The more money gets put into it, the more they're going to be able to do. But if the Russians are cash-strapped, we're going to see dribbles and drabs coming out of a defense industry that is not very effective. This doesn't mean we get to ignore the Russian Navy. What we have seen is that they will use what they've got to punch above their weight politically. And again, it's back to kind of my first thought, that you have to understand this politically as well as from a warfare context. They're not averse to being dangerous for the sake of being a little bit dangerous and provocative. They are operating in the same waters as we are, and they're not an ally, and they are doing these things, which means that you need responses, which I think, again, why this report outlines a very rational and reasonable set of responses. I think, I think the key when we think about our responses is they think we're pretty good, right? They're worried about falling behind in submarines. Worried about falling behind to China, who they've been selling some of their more advanced submarine systems to, but that's a different question. But they think we're bigger, stronger, and better. I think it's good to prove them right. I'll leave that there.
That's well said. Well, Steve, from the UK perspective, it'd be great to get your thoughts on how you see the Russian threat, but also the UK has already signaled in many ways through the SDSR in 2015 that there's an acknowledgement that ASW is a capability area that's needed. So would love to get your take on how you see the ASW challenge and how the UK is looking to meet it, and any thoughts you might have on working with the US and NATO on that.
Yeah, sure. And firstly, let me echo Olia's point on the use, valuable timing and use of this report. I think it's good because it shines a light on an area that's been a bit of a Cinderella in recent months and years while we've been focusing on other aspects of the new European security challenge. So let me offer you maybe 4 or 5 thoughts to answer your question, but also that stem from having a read the report. The first is a contextual one, and this is quite similar to Olia's first point, which is I think you have to think about the undersea issue in the broader context of the overall question about A2AD. So this is one facet of it, and it's important that we look at it in its own right, but it also strikes me as very crucial that we don't sort of lose sight of it as part of a broader issue that we have to deal with. And in that respect, one small little nuance that I thought was quite interesting was that while we were talking a lot in the report about the Baltic Sea and to some extent the Black Sea, both of those seas happen to have a Russian land base as part of them. And so one of the things we ought to be careful not to forget about when we're talking about undersea dominance and undersea threat is land-based systems and sensors that also have an impact on that environment. All of which I think emphasizes a conclusion that I think does come out in the report, which is we have to look at this whole issue through a strategic lens, not as individual stovepipe things. This is not about submarines or maritime patrol aircraft or space-based systems or anything else. It's about the whole thing and how do we deal with it. That's my first point. Second issue is that although the report rightly highlights, and I just came in at the end and heard the point about enhanced training and consistent training, which is absolutely correct, actually it's not like we're starting with a blank sheet of paper. So just last month we had the wonderfully titled Dynamic Mongoose exercise. I mean, if there's a competition for the best exercise name, that has to be quite well up there in the field, it strikes me. But that I checked my numbers, that had 3,000 sailors and aircrew from 8 allied countries taking part, doing specifically the things that you're talking about in the report. So using allied submarines as threats and as detection targets for the surface fleets and aircraft to work on. And that's the sort of thing we clearly have to sustain and do more of. Turning now to investment, quite right that a lot of focus has to be made on investment. And as you said, in our last Defence Review, published last November, UK has returned its investment priorities into exactly that space. We signed just last week in Farnborough the contract for the 9 new P-8 maritime patrol aircraft. We are investing in new Type 26 anti-submarine warfare frigate. All of those things take time, of course, but not least one of the reasons why the British government decided to go directly for a P-8 was its rapid availability for us, because this is a problem that we recognise we now have to let's say, pay more attention to than perhaps we thought we would have to when we were looking at this last time in 2010. And of course, one of the things that P8 gives us is not just an established airplane, an established capability, but also a really big opportunity for cooperation with the United States, with other users like Australia and potentially some of our other local allies in Europe in due course when they make their own decisions. And in that respect, while the recommendation in the report that Keflavik is expanded and used is important and right, let's not also forget that we will be basing our P8s in Lossiemouth in Scotland, which happens to be at the other end of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. And UK is the important bit from my perspective in that. And there's a really big opportunity there for us, I think, to work with the US Navy in Europe to use Lossiemouth at least as a forward operating base for the same purpose, and we're already having those conversations. Similarly, I think when we're talking about that particular part of the world, let's not forget what the G stands for, and Greenland is recovered for, it's covered for defence and security purposes by Denmark, a country with which the UK has long-standing defence relationship, as does the United States. And I think that gives you an opportunity there to begin to work very closely with the broader Nordic community. Generally speaking, there's a lot of focus in the report, perfectly rightly, on Sweden, Finland, and Norway. I would just say let's not forget Denmark in here because they're an important player. Last point from me, fora. I mean, you talked in the report about the potential use of Nordefco. There's a very good argument for doing that. There are other games in town too. We are part of a forum which we call the Northern Group, which comprises the UK with the Nordic, Baltic states, plus Germany, plus Poland, plus the Netherlands. So in practice, all of the countries that have a very clear interest, not just in the Baltic Sea, but also in the North Atlantic and its approaches. And the UK-led Joint Expeditionary Force, and joint matters because although the focus is on land generically, this is an all-arms capability. Also includes the Baltic states, Norway, the Netherlands, and Denmark as well. So I think as we go forward, one of the things that we will increasingly do, certainly from a UK perspective, is of course see this as a NATO issue because it's important we look at the alliance angles in this, but also recognise there are other fora which help bridge that gap to countries that don't happen to be allies and enable them to bring us along as well. So.
Well, let's build on exactly that point going to Brian. There's an incredible wealth of challenge sets for the United States Navy globally. Can you talk a little bit about where this sort of fits in and where the U.S. brings unique or particularly valuable expertise or capability and maybe where others can step in with complementary capability?
So I guess, so I would say that thinking about, like Olya said, it's really important to think about what the Russians might be trying to do with their submarine fleet, and therefore we can figure out approaches that might be able to counter them. By the way, the report is terrific. I really have to commend you on it. It did a great job of highlighting this challenge and how NATO and the U.S. might go about trying to deal with it. So if you, the small but very capable Russian submarine force, as Olya correctly pointed out, is not a great asset for trying to do large-scale operations. It doesn't give you the capacity to try to do large-scale strikes or try to do surface warfare against a big Navy fleet. But it does offer them, the Russians, the opportunity to put a threat against the United States homeland that otherwise they would have to achieve via intercontinental ballistic missiles, essentially. So during the Cold War, this was a huge concern of the United States, is that we had ways of trying to deter Russian large-scale nuclear attacks, but we didn't have a great way of preventing a Russian submarine from getting close to the U.S. coast and launching an unwarned attack on the U.S. homeland. So that seems like it might be a far out there scenario. But if you think about it, if we get into some conflict with the Russians in Eastern Europe, an opportunity for them might be to impart to U.S. leaders that there's Russian submarines near the U.S. coast that could conduct an escalatory attack on the U.S., try to do a decapitating attack with a nuclear weapon, or just a conventional strike that causes the United States to have to pour resources into defending our own coastlines in a way that we haven't had to do since World War II. So that might be one of the approaches that the Russians are trying to use with their submarine force because of its small size but high capability. So given that, it makes it very important that the GI-UK gap, as Stephen pointed out, is protected and that we have a way of tracking submarines that pass that barrier and keep an eye on them until they complete their deployments. That was something we did during the Cold War because of this concern about the potential for Russian submarines to attack the U.S. coastline. So you think about the United States right now does this by mounting a pretty significant anti-submarine effort up in the GIUK Gap in the northern Atlantic, and then sending submarine after submarine to trail these guys as they make their deployment south, which puts a big demand on U.S. submarines. Because they're some of the only submarines capable of doing this kind of track and trail operation. Well, opportunities for allies to contribute to that would be, for one, Britain has excellent attack submarines. I've gone to sea on the Astute. We did an exercise tracking a Virginia-class submarine, and they do pretty good at that. So it's a very capable submarine. The crews are very proficient. They're good at that kind of operation. So right now, Britain has a demand to send a submarine over to east of Suez, traditionally, almost continuously, which kind of keeps the Astute-class submarines busy, just maintaining that presence over in the Middle East. If instead they were to shift some of that focus and contribute to this effort to try to monitor Russian attack submarine deployments, that would offer an opportunity to reduce the demand on U.S. forces. If you think about also this idea of finding the submarine as it's leaving the Barents and the Norwegian Sea, Britain and other countries that have maritime patrol aircraft can contribute to that effort, because the main way that you do that is you use a submarine or a deployed sensor like the SOSUS arrays, or now you would use unmanned sensors, and there's a lot of capabilities that are out there that can contribute to that, to initially find the submarine, and then you send an airplane out there to drop sonobuoys, or in the future unmanned undersea vehicles, to get an idea of where it is, and then you kind of follow it along until a submarine can then pick it up, and then the submarine trails it for the remainder of the time that you need to keep an eye on it. Well, those other countries that are in the region, so Norway, Britain, the other NATO allies could contribute maritime patrol aircraft to that mission, or they could contribute unmanned sensors to that mission, which has a lower barrier to entry for some of these countries that may not be able to mount the kind of investment you would need to create a maritime patrol aircraft capability from scratch. But a lot of these unmanned systems just need a tending vessel. So a country like a Sweden or a Finland or Denmark could contribute that vessel and buy some of these unmanned systems to conduct that surveillance operation. So there's opportunities there for the partners and allies to contribute to the main effort that would be having to be undertaken against Russian submarine deployments.
Can I ask you, and others can comment on this too, the very particular environment of the Baltic Sea,
Right.
which is a different animal altogether. And the types, and it's also an environment in which the U.S. has not traditionally
Right.
had the best expertise among the various
Right.
allies and partners that can bring something. How should we be thinking about a networked approach inside the Baltic, and maybe in particular also Russia, Olya, I'm not going to call you Russia, Olya, maybe you could comment on how the Russians might think differently if they do about the Baltic. So I don't, either Steve or Brian, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the Baltic is I've been up there on surface ships, and it's a very, very challenging environment. As you noted, so it's shallow. There's a lot of mines in the
Right.
bottom of the seabed still, and
The salinity.
acoustically very difficult. Salinity is very hard to deal with. So submarines have a hard time there, and even countries that are in the region. So the Russians don't do a lot of submarine deployments there, which is why they have such a small number up in St. Petersburg. But there's opportunities there because of the shallow water and because of the acoustic environment that may be unmanned sensors and some acoustic arrays. There are some passive technologies where you could put sensors on the bottom there and be able to monitor a shallow area like that for submarine operations. And it can be pretty effective because it is such a constrained area that even a short-range system can give you coverage over what's needed if you particularly look at choke points as you're going out of the Baltic and into the North Sea.
Steve, do you have anything to add
Yeah,
on
two other points really just to emphasize that. First is the other thing that's different about the Baltics is it's an inland sea, effectively.
Right.
It is surrounded by land, which provides some more opportunities for greater use of systems that exist. The other piece about it is that, much to people's surprise perhaps, that the level of coordination on even surface traffic monitoring in the Baltic Sea has not been as great as you might think it would be. And it's only in recent years that we've been developing with the countries in that part of the world membership of an organization or a system that enables us to join up surface tracking of vessels coming in and out of the Baltic Sea. We clearly need to think about doing that for subsurface tracking too. But I think the opportunity is there and the political will is there. Of course, the big catch is the investment there, and that's the
Right.
question.
So a few thoughts. One, not on this topic, but just wanted to respond to Brian. I'm not really that worried about the Russians attacking the U.S. homeland. I think they're pretty well deterred. You know, I worry about a lot of things, but an escalatory strike on the U.S. homeland, I think we're in really bad shape if that's happening for a whole lot of reasons, and we are prepared for it, and we're probably all dead within about 45 minutes. So, I mean, you know, happy thought, but, you know, I think that is what you're talking about when you start talking about homeland strikes. The Baltic is interesting. I'm going to echo some points. It's not a great submarine area. The Russians, insofar as they prioritize anything in their Navy, prioritize submarines. They don't prioritize their Baltic fleet, right? They prioritize their Northern fleet. The Baltic fleet has not gotten as much. It's maybe somewhere above the Caspian flotilla in terms of attention, but it's below the Black Sea fleet, which has gotten a lot more activity recently. They've also just fired most of the senior command of the Baltic fleet for corruption and incompetence. So I think, you know, let's not get too excited about Russian capabilities in the Baltic. Insofar as we pay attention to Russian capabilities in the Baltic, I do think this is a place where the United States should rely on its allies and friends in the neighborhood who are familiar with this environment, who have been operating in it, who have been watching the Russians there. And that's kind of my take on playing to core competencies, right? And making sure that you can take advantage of what your friends bring to the table.
I just want to push a little bit on this issue of how serious the challenge set is in the Baltic. We do try to be, I think you kindly put it as rational and reasonable, but you know, easy for us to say here when you travel through the region, as people think, as Steve said, about an overall A2AD challenge set, and you think if you're sitting in anywhere from Finland to Poland to the Balts or Sweden, and you're thinking about how Russia could bring to bear even minimal submarine capability as part of an overall A2AD challenge set, it was, at least to me, somewhat remarkable how little has progressed on the Allied side. Even though the Russians, as you say, have put it low on their priority list, it's still better than nothing, you know. So,
yes.
You know, I guess this gets to the issue of how seriously should we take overall the joint military approach of the Russians with, as they pop up everywhere and show force. Is it just show of force, or are they really exercising some operational capability that can be relevant?
Of course it's both, right? But the question is, what is the operational capability for? And yes, there's an A2AD component. You don't want other people operating in your area, right? And if you don't want them exercising, playing, being free in your area, that also means you're exercising the capability to keep them out in the event of conflict, right? These are kind of the same thing. And a lot of it is Russia pointing out that it's their neighborhood, that they're active there, that you have to reckon with them. And again, do we plan to fight a war there? They really don't plan to fight a war there. I mean, there is very little evidence to suggest that that's a thing. This is what they're trying to avert, a war there. They're trying, you know, it's all a mutual deterrence game. Now, that doesn't mean we stay out of it, right? It doesn't mean we have to say, okay, that's fine, we're not too worried, we're deterred. But it does mean that we have to keep in mind that our goal is keeping them not wanting to fight that war. Rather than encouraging it.
Steve, I want to just pick up, and we'll open to the audience in just a minute. I want to pick up on the points you and Brian made between you about the importance of sensor networks and working together across NATO, but then also beyond NATO. It would seem to me that, as in almost all areas, the information sharing challenges here are significant, and or at least I should say it's important that we overcome information sharing barriers. Is this an area that's been a focus from your perspective in the UK, or even for NATO, to think about how to make sure that we have fluid information sharing on anti-submarine capabilities?
I mean, yes and no is the short answer to that. I mean, yes, on the one hand, because everyone recognises the more you can share information, the better we will get at doing this stuff. In this particular domain, there are, of course, limitations from all of us because of our own sovereign capabilities. And I think that's something that we've managed over the years in very close working relationships between the US and UK. We have to see how we can extend that out in other directions with other countries. But I also think the nature of what we're dealing with, to slightly pick up, I think the thing that Olya was trying to get to, can be more simple than people like to try and make it. At the end of the day, it's a big ocean and submarines can be small, but there are also certain geographical features that enable you to do things in a more ready way than you might. And in the Baltic, we've already talked about that. It's certainly the same in the context of the Greenland, UK, Iceland gap. So there are ways that we used to do this in the Cold War. Perhaps some of the point is we have to re-understand and relearn some of those lessons.
Same kind of question for you, Brian. Is your perception that in the U.S. Navy that there's an appreciation for the need to work with our allies and partners in this space, in what's really been a traditionally the ultimate sovereign space really has been our subsurface warfare. Is there an openness to getting to a point where we can share information as needed?
And so I guess the difference might be looking at undersea warfare that we do with submarines, where we maybe don't have a lot of information sharing, and anti-submarine warfare, which the U.S. does traditionally with airplanes and surface ships. So there's more information sharing on the anti-submarine warfare side.
Sure.
And the allies have effective capabilities, and there's been examples of for example, the operations in the GIUK gap that we've done over the Cold War and still do today are examples of effective information sharing that's done between allies to accomplish that mission of anti-submarine warfare. Undersea warfare is very different.
Sure.
We don't necessarily have the same level of information sharing, but it's improving. So with the UK, the US shares a lot of its submarine information. They're trying to increase the amount they share with France, and then other countries less so, partly because they don't have the capability necessarily to exploit the technologies and the operational concepts that the U.S. submarine force might use. So there's maybe less need for that.
Good, very helpful. Okay, we're going to open it up for questions, and I'm going to ask you when I call on you to give your name and your affiliation if you have one. Vago, we'll start with you. There's a mic coming your way.
Thanks very much. Great panel, and any panel that talks a lot about submarines is okay in my book. Two-part question. Perhaps the former submariner in the room wants to address this. Throughout the Cold War, we spent a lot of time doing anti-submarine warfare, and pretty much everybody acknowledges we weren't as good at it as we wanted to be. What are we doing to get further up the curve, given that everybody has gotten very rusty in this skill set, even though everybody is focusing more attention on it? And the second question is, from an undersea infrastructure standpoint, the Russian versions of NR1 are particularly vexing from that standpoint. And at this point, we're trying to track them. Some talk whether or not surface ships are carrying them as well, sometimes to certain places that makes detection and tracking very difficult. And when you look at it against our undersea infrastructure, we don't have the capabilities that we once have to literally have the oceans wired the way once upon a time we did. So it's kind of a two-part thing for anybody to take it. What are some of the things we have to do to get better on the power curve? But the second thing is, what is the investment level, and is anybody interested to invest what's necessary to invest to deal with the problem, especially if it starts to get disruptive for undersea cables that are carrying something like 95% of everything that we depend on, which is not going through space?
So I'll say on the first part, Vago, anti-submarine warfare proficiency is something people talk about a lot, and obviously a lot of training is necessary, and you have to do a lot of operations to stay up on the curve. One thing we're finding that I think is going to be a feature of future anti-submarine warfare is moving away from these very labor-intensive and skill-intensive approaches to anti-submarine warfare, where I've got to go out and practice it every day and get really good at being able to recognize what the trace looks like of this submarine versus that submarine, and know the different sound signatures, and the art rather than the science. We're moving away from that and towards a lot more technological solutions that enable you to do the kinds of things underwater that we've done above the water for a long time. So, automatic target recognition technologies that enable you to more rapidly have a sound signature get classified as something you care about or something you don't care about. The automatic target motion analysis and fire control systems that can do that. So the things that we do with radar today, increasingly we are looking at doing those with acoustic energy as well. So it's turning some anti-submarine warfare from art to science, and it's becoming a little bit more, and it's likely to be in the future, much more of the fire and forget kind of approach to warfare, that we use in anti-air warfare or in strike warfare than it is this very labor and skill intensive effort that takes hours or days to undertake. I would draw a big distinction there between that kind of shift towards a fire and forget kind of approach in combat to what we do in peacetime, which is this very surveillance intensive, labor intensive effort to track and trail a submarine so I can build the intelligence knowledge that lets me develop the technology to do the more fire and forget method that I'm going to use in wartime. So anti-submarine warfare has these two very different dimensions that require almost two entirely different approaches. And one problem we have right now is that we try to use the same approach for both. We think of anti-submarine warfare is really hard because you think about how we do it today in a surveillance mode, but when it comes to fighting, I'm probably going to take a much different approach. And if you look at previous conflicts where we've actually shot at submarines, it's been much more about just shooting at the submarine to make it go away, and then maybe 20% of the time you actually kill it, but the submarine's off and not bothering you anymore. So I think we have to return to that idea that combat is different than surveillance in peacetime for anti-submarine warfare.
Anyone else want to come? Okay. We'll go right down.
I mean, for the undersea infrastructure, though.
Yeah,
so
please.
yeah, we have not. So undersea infrastructure, big vulnerability for the United States. I'd say the vulnerability that we have to consider is not so much undersea cables. There's about 300 undersea cables around the world that carry all the 95% of the communication traffic. But right now, about a quarter of them are dark. They're not being used, and so there's spare capacity available. Now, it's not always in the place you need it. And there have been outages. There's outages all the time where we have about 50 or 60 of those outages a year, and they get repaired, and we move on. So we're finding that as the infrastructure has been built up undersea, we're now at the point where there's enough spare capacity and the ability to recover it that this idea of a catastrophic loss of communications is not as big a scenario for a big country like the United States. It can be a big problem for a country that's relatively isolated or whose cables all go to the same place and then can be easily interdicted. So that's something that's more specific to a particular country or a particular location. The bigger undersea infrastructure challenge, I believe, is just the idea that we've got a lot of stuff undersea that make potential targets that would create a demand for very labor-intensive responses. So if Russia was to attack a piece of undersea infrastructure in the Gulf of Mexico and cause an oil spill or something, it wouldn't be catastrophic for the U.S. economy, but it'd be a huge cost for the U.S. to now defend that because it would be obvious that that was a requirement that had to be met. So it's more of a cost imposition strategy than it is truly a war-winning strategy.
Okay, we'll go right here.
Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former diplomat. In a littoral environment, is it possible to use magnetic anomaly detection aboard a drone or perhaps even lighter than aircraft on a continuous basis to really effectively reveal all Russian maneuvers 24 hours a day? It seems to me that might be possible and not even that expensive.
So magnetic anomaly detection does work, and it must work. We've been deploying them on aircraft for generations. So yes, it is a technology that works. It's extremely short range, and so one thing you got to think about is if it can only detect a submarine, a mile or two away or whatever, it's a very short range. Then how many of those surveillance aircraft am I going to need to be covering an area of ocean? So if you can think about the cost becomes sort of astronomical very quickly. There's ideas of shifting those to unmanned vehicles, like little unmanned vehicles that you could buy in large numbers. They have short endurance, so that's the downside. So now I've got to replenish them very frequently. So magnetic anomaly detection is a technology that could be used, but you got to think about it as being a much more localized approach than maybe as a search technique.
There has been, of course, significant debate, conversation around whether there are technologies in the near offing that could fundamentally change the undersea paradigm. You've written on this before, Brian. Do you want to just comment more generally on that?
So, yeah, right. So in general, what's happening is because of this, the quieting of submarines and the increasing capability of them to hide from passive sonar, it's likely that countries are going to shift to trying to use more active sonar technologies, which a lot of the current submarines are not. They're designed to maybe defend against because they use coatings and various things, but they're going to be much more vulnerable to that than they would be to passive sonar. So that's something that's already happening. You can see that our allies, NATO allies, already field variable depth sonars that operate in good frequency ranges for active sonar, and the Russians and the Chinese are pursuing similar technologies. Also, non-acoustic technologies, like magnetic anomaly detection, are improving, and so it's feasible that in some couple generations those technologies would be able to contribute as well. But the big thing that points out, though, is that the focus that we've had on submarine quieting won't be sufficient. I mean, it means you can't build a noisy submarine anymore because you still got to deal with passive sonar, but you're going to have to deal with the fact that the undersea world is going to be is more like the above the water world, where active sonar is going to be a problem, just like radar is a problem. So I have to think about hiding myself using acoustic energy to jam or to decoy, as well as being quiet when it comes to dealing with passive sonar. So it makes the below the water world much more like the above the water world.
Very good. Okay, and then Sydney.
Thank you all. Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. Mr. McCarthy, question particularly for you, although if other people wish to second guess your comments, I welcome that as a member of the media. One of the things that I was struck by in the report was how starkly Royal Navy capability has declined in this area, more so than perhaps a lot of other allies that weren't starting from such a high base, with retirement of Nimrod, with the carrier capacity going away. What of the things like P-8, the carriers, Type 26, Type whatever that's coming next, will help rebuild that UK anti-submarine warfare capacity? And to what degree, because the UK retains its global ambitions, it has the submarine east of Suez, does the UK risk spreading itself too thin, doing the opposite of this idea that the NATO powers should each develop a niche and not try to do it all, because none of them has the economy to support doing it all?
Well, the three capabilities you listed are part of the answer to your question. So the reinvestment in maritime patrol aircraft, specifically an anti-submarine capability, it also has search and rescue type activities, but it's fundamentally an anti-submarine capability. The reinvestment in, or the investment that will come in the 26 program, which is to replace our current Type 23 anti-submarine warfare, is next generation warfare surface, anti-submarine warfare surface vessels. And so one of the things that the SDSR 2015, last year's one, specifically did as a change of direction, if you like, was end what sometimes gets called the carrier and MPA pause in British capability, with a view to replacing both of the things that we deleted in the 2010 review. If you take that point as a starter, though, the reason that the UK decided to get out of the maritime patrol aircraft and the carrier-based capabilities in 2010 was entirely to do with affordability of the forward program. So, the government of the day took some pretty painful decisions which we didn't want to take in an ideal world in order to make the program balanced. But even while we did that, we began to invest in the new carrier capabilities. We began to build those vessels, and they're now significantly advanced, will come into service in the next few years. And we retained, from a skills perspective, a seaborne capability by posting British airmen onto American or Australian and other nations' maritime patrol capabilities. So we kept the skills base going in a seaborne way, even through that gap, so that when maritime patrol aircraft return to RAF inventory at the end of this decade, when the P-8 comes into service, we already have a crew of people that will be the trainers for the next generation. So while it's true that we took the pause, very much the focus of a lot of the investment decision we took last year is to get back into that space. And that's in part because, as the report points out, 5-6 years ago, we thought this was not such a strategic priority. Now it seems to be coming back again, and we're responding to that.
It's probably also just worth mentioning in passing, it's slightly off topic, the Parliament passed approved the successor program continuation this week. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, it was an important parliamentary moment for us. The vote to replace the UK's submarine-based continuous at sea deterrence passed on Monday by an overwhelming majority, in fact, something like 100 votes more than the last time the vote was put to Parliament about 10 years ago. And so, I think in this context, that's a slightly different version of undersea warfare, but it's obviously very important to us. And part of the rationale for some of that reinvestment in ASW capability is to protect that deterrent capability.
Sure. Okay, I had a question in the back over here. Left side needs to...
Yes, I'm Russell King, former Naval Control Shipping Officer, with a question for Ms. Olfer, I believe. Right now, there's consideration of the Northern Sea route becoming an international route, and that might take a few years, obviously, but I was wondering what the impact or what the relationship of the undersea situation in the North Atlantic is to the development of that route from the standpoint of all the stakeholders in that route.
You mean in terms of trade?
What's that?
You mean in terms of trade?
Or military?
Well, in terms of how does the undersea situation in the North Atlantic, how would it impact that? I would think that if we're going to have a sea route that would become an international sea route potentially, we would certainly want to be concerned with the undersea situation and how it impacts that.
So Russia is one of the bigger proponents of shipping stuff through the north. You know, they're the most excited people about global warming, I think, on the planet, because it will, you know, they think it will improve their ability to transport goods. So I'm not terribly worried about their trying to disrupt that militarily as long as everybody's at peace. If any more than in any other route where you have military capabilities as well as commercial capabilities, which is everywhere. If you have a war, then of course commercial shipping is endangered, but again, the same as it would be anywhere else. So I don't know that this theater presents a particularly unique or interesting consideration in the context.
Actually, can I just make a point on that?
Yeah,
I think you can look at it the other way around, actually, to some extent. From a military strategic perspective, it offers you some opportunities because a number of the world's trade choke points, like the Straits of Malacca, may suddenly become rather less significant than they currently are. And it's quite hard to be a pirate in the Arctic, I suspect. So, you know, so there is a sense in which the shifting global trade patterns, if and when that happens, actually change the dynamic of the way the world's trade systems work, and that will, of course, have a consequence for military strategic planning in due course.
Well, and it could create, again, tertiary effect, but it could create more competitors for resources for naval capability because search and rescue, other requirements start to go up.
Yeah.
That creates challenges for balancing, I would assume, all those.
But I think overall, the
Yeah.
commercial development,
Yeah.
you know, if anything, it creates greater disincentives to militarize.
Sure.
Although you also have the desire to protect your investments, as you can see by the Russian movements in the Arctic that are military.
Yeah. Okay, very good. I thought I had another one over here. Yes, please.
I'm Hank Gaffney. I don't have access to classified. Of course, Dmitry Gorenberg and I did a lot of studies of the Russian Navy, and I've been Googling to find out what the condition of the SSNs in the Northern Fleet have been, and I'm not being able to pin down the numbers. I can figure out maybe 5 Akulas are good, although they've been listed as being under repair for a long time. And I think there's one Sierra 1 and another is supposed to emerge in 2017. I even see one Victor 3 still alive. Are they really operative? Are they good?
Order of battle.
Over to you. Oh, so, you know, you can read Dmitry, who also tries to count this and spends more time doing it in his day-to-day life than I do. I think it's interesting to look at patrol rates as well as what's operational and what's not. Patrol rates are still pretty low, and I find that striking. And then in terms of what goes in for repair, what comes back out for repair, yeah, it depends on when you look, and the news varies, and perhaps the folks following it on the classified realm have a better sense of it. But my guess is if you're Googling and you're paying attention to what folks are saying, you have about as good a sense of it as I do. You've got probably about as good a sense of it as I do. I don't have any, special insights.
Others? Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Okay, very good. And I had one more somewhere. Yes, right here.
Hopefully my company forgives me for asking the question, as I'm Michael Lee from EB, but that's Electric Boat. Sorry, we do nuke subs. So there is the NATO E3 Sentry pool, there's the NATO C-17 pool. Any chance of like a NATO P-8 or whatever they roll out next out of Airbus, I'm assuming, for their next generation MPA. And obviously, with the lower barriers of entry, some sort of alliance common, platform that, doesn't matter whether it's a Norwegian, what the heck, Sweden, Finland, frigate, patrol craft that you could just, take it around to whoever.
Okay, pooling and sharing ASW.
Do you want me to start on
Yeah,
that? The road of potential NATO collaborative programs is long and strewn with rubble. I think there are some quite good arguments for thinking about it in principle. In practice, it tends to come out not quite that way, not least because, particularly in this domain that we're discussing today, there tends to be a lot of concern to keep national sovereign capabilities. So one of the issues with developing a NATO-wide capability is who owns it, who orders it to go where, what's the basis on which it does its own patrolling. And the need, in particular, with relatively scarce assets still in this world, to sometimes send them somewhere outside of the NATO theatre of operations. So that's always been one of the concerns that the UK at least has had about engagement in NATO-wide capabilities. Our approach is more in the UK based on trying to pool and share capabilities and make sure they're all interoperable and give them all the intelligence and all of the training and all the collective activity that we can support them, but make sure that individual nations provide those assets for the broader good rather than having a big collective exercise program.
Can I just ask, building off of that, you mentioned in your remarks about working with the U.S. on rotational ASW or MPA in particular out of Lossiemouth, if I'm saying that correctly. Do you think there's opportunity there to move beyond US-UK and have a broader sort of opportunities for exercises or rotational operations out of that location?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably for the future. We need one or two countries to take some important decisions first.
Yes. Yeah.
But once they do, assuming that they do, then that'll certainly be on the agenda.
Very good. Okay, I want to thank everyone for coming this morning. I want to thank in particular our research team, Andrew Metrick, Lisa, Sam. I see Kathleen Weissenberg back there, who's one of our former interns who helped us on this, and the full team here at CSIS. I also want to thank our panelists, Brian Clark, Steve McCarthy, Olga Olger. I hope everyone has a chance to review the report, and please feel free to follow up with our research team if you have follow-on questions. So join me in thanking our panelists.